Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little conversation that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And I think that pretty much as I said within my video as of yesterday, talking about the UFC 314 card, I think I'm going to start talking about the mixed martial arts game, or especially the UFC game, a little bit more. Especially because UFC, they pretty much have all the top dogs. But of course, one of the rising stars within that of the UFC, or MMA, especially within that of the past few years, of course, has been this dude right here, Mr. Paddy the Baddy Pimblett. I believe a fighter that has been that from Scotland and, been a little bit hyped over the years. But of course, Paddy the Baddy Pimblett on the UFC 314 co-main event, he was just recently able to get probably the most dominant and the most impressive and certainly the biggest win of his career over that of Michael Chandler, I believe, Iron Michael Chandler, whatever his nickname is, where of course he was able to get the stoppage, I believe, within that of the third round in a 5-round fight. And he probably, at least in my personal view, had the most impressive performance over a Michael Chandler out of any other fighter within that weight class. And of course, for those of you that have been watching MMA for the past several years, you know that the lightweight division has pretty much been the creme de la creme of the MMA divisions, pretty much out of any other weight class. And there's been some very other talented weight classes, like, at the 205 weight class with guys like Prohashka and Jamal Hill and, of course, Khalil Roundtree and Alex Pieta and other guys like that, Ankalaev and, other weight classes that maybe I'm not thinking of. 170, of course, when it had Usman and Gilbert Burns and Masvidal and Covington and those guys. But 155 probably has produced the most amount of talent out of any other division, probably within that of the past 10 plus years. And when you talk about it, right now, even with all the fighters that Michael Chandler ended up losing to at the 155-pound weight class, Paddy the Baddy, at least so far, had seemingly beat him in the best of fashions. Now, of course, the question is about that is that more of a factor because Paddy is just that good? Is it because Michael Chandler was just overrated or was he getting a bit old? What is it? Because, of course, a certain amount of people, they're kind of wondering how good is Paddy the Baddy Pimblett really? And what I'll personally state is this. It's very obvious that Paddy the Baddy Pimblett, that, he's being a little bit hyped up, of course, to possibly be the next Conor McGregor, but there definitely is, a real talent within this fighter. Do I think that he's completely flawless? No, I don't. But I definitely think that a certain amount of the people that are starting to come up with all these excuses all of a sudden, where heading into this fight, even though Paddy was the favorite heading into this fight, this was looked at as a 50-50 fight or a fight that could be troublesome for Paddy the Baddy heading into this fight. And Paddy pretty much, other than that of the first round, really did not have that much of a problem handling that of a Michael Chandler. And now, of course, you have a certain amount of people stating that, well, that's because Michael Chandler was never that good in the first place. And, that's because Michael Chandler is getting old and he's washed up and blah, blah, blah. Well, just in my personal view, what I'll state is this, because sometimes, both things can be a little bit true. What I'll personally state is this. I don't know if Michael Chandler was quote unquote washed up. I think that Michael Chandler, that to be honest with you, that he was one of these guys that was always great in Bellator, a guy that, or a promotion, excuse me, that, pretty much had some very talented fighters, but it's no offense, but any of the champions in that of the Bellator circuit, or really outside of the Bellator circuit, or excuse me, outside of the UFC circuit, they pretty much have to come to that of the UFC to prove to me that they're actually legitimately the best fighter in the world in that weight class. Now, of course, there's been certain fighters that have moved to that of the UFC that, eventually did become the champion. Like, of course, what we've seen with the Dricus du Plessis, of course, the South African fighter, and Eddie Alvarez, of course, once upon a time, I believe, fought for Bellator and, maybe fought with another promotion. He came to the UFC and, of course, lost to Donald Cerrone his first fight, but then, of course, was able to beat that, I believe, of Anthony Pettis and then Rafael dos Santos for the title. So, I mean, it's not like that's never happened, but oftentimes, more than not, when a fighter moves from that of Bellator or possibly another promotion, and they're especially used to fighting all these guys that, let's be real, are kind of second rate guys that aren't really the creme de la creme or are not really the top tier level guys. They come to the UFC and then they really find out what's what. And we've seen that with Michael Chandler. We also seen that with Ben Askren, who was a champion, I believe, and won championship for years for fighting these guys that, let's be real, were nowhere near as talented as the UFC guys. He fights Jorge Masvidal, who in my view is always a little bit overrated, and he gets knocked out. It just is what it is. But the thing being is that, there also is a little bit of truth to Paddy the Baddy Pimblett also just having a very dominant performance. It just is what it is. No one had really looked that good against Michael Chandler in that of the UFC, and I got to give him a great amount of credit. Not even Charles Oliveira in the last fight, where I pretty much thought Charles Oliveira won every single round in that fight. Not even Charles Oliveira was really able to stop him, within that fight, or really, from what I remember, able to hurt him that severely. Now, in the first fight, of course, he ended up stopping him. And, of course, we all know that, he lost to Gagey, but in a very tough and close competitive fight in a 3-round fight. And, of course, against Dustin, the Diamond Poirier. Poirier may have even been potentially losing that fight until, of course, the rear naked choke within that of the 3rd round. So the fact that Paddy the Baddy Pimblett, the fact that other than that of the 1st round, he pretty much had an almost flawless performance and was able to hurt Michael Chandler to the degree and cut him open to where it had to be stopped within the 3rd round, I thought that it was a very impressive performance. Now, do I think that Michael Chandler was ever the most talented fighter, especially compared to those, wolves or those lions at the 155-pound weight class? Do I think that Michael Chandler is as great or as talented of a fighter as guys like Dustin Poirier or Justin Gaethje or Max Holloway or Islam Makhachev or even guys like Ilia Topuria if he moves up to 155? No, probably not. But the thing is that Michael Chandler still had relative talent. He also was a decent athlete. And he was a guy that did give very tough fights to certain guys. Even like a Charles Oliveira in the first outing. He survived against Oliveira in the second fight. He gave hell to both Justin Gaethje and Dustin Poirier. So we have to give Paddy the Baddy Pimblett a little bit of credit here. But it's very obvious that a certain amount of people that they realize that Paddy the Baddy, that he's being a little bit hyped up, and that Dana White, that he wants to try to hitch his wagon to Paddy's star, and that he's trying to make him into the next Conor McGregor. And that leads to a certain amount of hate, not only within a certain amount of fans, but also within a certain amount of UFC fighters. It's going to lead to a certain amount of jealousy and a certain amount of hatred. That just happens over with certain guys that are looked at as stars, especially before they become a champion, because they look at it as some sort of entitlement and, not getting something or not earning something that they may truly deserve. I seen the same thing with Conor McGregor when he was first going up in the UFC. When he became a champion, or even before he became a champion, there would be articles at times. I remember from Bleacher Report, there was this one article when Conor McGregor would come up and they stated that, I'm not impressed with this resume and here's why. He fought a Dustin Poirier that, was weaker at 145. He fought a Chad Mendes on short notice, blah, 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 all sort of stuff. So the point being is that although I understand certain people's points, there definitely is a little bit of jealousy and a little bit of hatred here, because they realize that Paddy the Baddy Pimblett, that he's kind of the next star upcoming. And is that me stating that maybe he's going to beat Islam Makhachev or become the champion there? Not necessarily. We never know. But they definitely realize that, Dana White, that he's trying to make this guy into a star. And it just is what it is. Certain people just have that appeal. Certain people do not. Paddy, he has, that European, kind of Conor McGregor appeal that Dana White is still kind of looking to replace with. But we'll see. But anyways, Paddy the Baddy, he's going to talk about his victory. He's also going to be talking about the possibility of who he's going to fight next. Let's get into it.
If you look at that active win streak, there's still some guys ranked ahead of Paddy Pimblett, but nobody has a longer win streak than him in that top rankings. He is only behind Islam Makhachev with 14. Now he has 7. Paddy, interesting night, man, and you have had a lot of them here in the UFC, but this one, now you're calling out Gaethje and they're showing him on the screen. Dustin Poirier is up here. This is just a different level of energy. You're in the biggest conversations now. Does it feel any different to you?
No, I always said this.
Just to talk about Justin Gaethje and Dustin Poirier real quick, 2 of the more entertaining fighters, and of course 2 of the greater fighters that never ever won a belt within their respective UFC careers. 2 great fighters. I always talk about with one of my best friends, about Max Holloway. He's my best friend is a trainer in jiu-jitsu, and he did not believe in a lot of the effectiveness of boxing, but then eventually he started to believe in boxing again because of Max Holloway. And he stated that, I'm surprised that you're not the biggest fan of Max Holloway's boxing ability, at least compared to some other fighters, because, he's what made me believe in boxing again, of course, after the knockout of a Justin Gaethje. Now, he did beat Justin Gaethje, but in my view, Justin Gaethje kind of fought the wrong type of fight for that fight. Because Justin Gaethje, kind of the best and the worst thing that ever ended up happening to Justin Gaethje is that he got that very technical knockout, breakdown victory over Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson is a guy that moves his head very little, and he's a guy that strikes a lot, and he's lengthy for his size, so he gets away with certain stuff. He also has excellent conditioning and stamina, but Tony Ferguson is not a boxer. Tony Ferguson throws a lot of these very weird, unorthodox strikes that, at times work, but also at times can be a little bit advertised. And when Justin Gaethje was using his feet, and on top of that, a little bit of his boxing ability to move outside of the range, he pretty much was catching Tony Ferguson with 1 or 2 punches throughout the whole entire time. But when you talk about as an all-around fighter, especially as a striker, Max Holloway is a better striker than Tony Ferguson, especially intellectually. He just is. He's a better boxer than Tony Ferguson. So what Max Holloway did is that he pretty much said, okay, I'm going to start off with the jab. I'm going to start to slowly pick Justin Gaethje apart. I'm going to make him chase me. I'm not just going to run straight into his shots, and I'm going to pick him off incrementally. And Justin Gaethje, I thought, was a little bit too technical for his own good. Now, there are certain fighters that can out-technique Max Holloway, because Max Holloway, although he is a very good boxer and he's a very great fighter and a great striker especially, he can get outboxed by certain people. We've seen it happen before. If you don't want to count the Conor McGregor loss, because of course Holloway wasn't necessarily at his peak there, he also was outboxed by Ilia Topuria. He was outboxed by Alexander Volkanovski on 3 separate occasions. He also was outboxed and clearly dominated by Dustin Poirier, in their second fight. So it just is what it is. So it's not impossible to beat Max Holloway in that category. But the thing is about Justin Gaethje is that he's not the boxer of those guys. He's not the intellectual striker of those guys. Gaethje is a guy that, he pretty much has to get in the mix and try to hurt you, especially with his leg kicks. Because if he doesn't, he can potentially get you with the punches. But if you're a very technical striker like a Dustin Poirier or a Holloway or an Ilia Topuria or a Volkanovski, if he doesn't end up hurting you or really try to threaten you with some of his power shots or his legs especially, he's going to have a little bit of a problem there. Now, of course, he was able to beat Dustin Poirier in that rematch, but of course he was able to end that fight with a kick. And I think Dustin Poirier kind of, did not take that fight with the right technique or with the right tactic. I think that he thought that Gaethje was going to come towards him. He didn't. And once Gaethje was on the back foot, I think Dustin was a little bit surprised and it kind of threw him off kilter. But it is what it is. But I just wanted to talk about that very quickly because, that just goes to show you that styles make fights. Dustin Poirier, of course, dominated Max Holloway, in my personal view, at least beat him 4 rounds to 1. And then, of course, Holloway beats Gaethje, a guy that knocks out Dustin Poirier. So it just goes to show you that styles make fights. But Max Holloway, as great of a striker as what he is, he does have a problem with changing levels. He also has a problem with moving his head off the center line. And on top of that, Holloway is a guy that has shorter arms for his size than what he probably does. So sometimes that causes him, to kind of, throw certain things with not moving his head as much.
This was going to happen, But as I always said, this was in my future. People laughed at me when I first said it and said I weren't going to do it. I can remember getting laughed at and said I'll never be ranked. I'll never be in the top 10. Now I'm going to be ranked 7 on Monday. And then I'm coming for the top 5 and then the title.
And can I ask you, I think I've asked you this before, but you are so fueled by doubters. You call them a gang of mushrooms today, and it is. You come up here and you say,
Scottish and British fighters always have the funniest names for people when they insult people. I've seen the same thing with Tyson Fury. Now, I don't think Tyson Fury is Scottish, but he's from Britain. And Tyson Fury would always say the same shit. Like, whenever he would talk about Deontay Wilder, he'd be like, he ain't worth the sausage. Tyson Fury would always go up on the stage and call people that.
Yeah, you say it in every post-fight speech, too. You're like, what now? I keep proving you wrong. Why do you love proving the doubters so wrong?
It's just something in my city we love doing, know what I mean? In Liverpool, people try and put us down. They have done for years and years and years.
Of course, and as an athlete, I think that that's actually a good thing to, it's not good to pay attention to all the comments and all the hate that you get. That can actually affect your mind negatively, but it's not a bad thing overall to sometimes take in negative energy and turn it into positive energy or turn it into motivation. I don't think overall that that's a bad thing at all. And obviously, Paddy the Baddy, he has seemingly done that.
And we just love proving people wrong and coming back and showing everyone that we won't be beaten, know what I mean? We'll keep coming back and coming back and coming back. That knee was absolutely lovely, by the way. That's just picture perfect watching it back.
Definitely was. And for the knee, for those of you that don't know what ended up happening, Paddy the Baddy, I believe, ended up landing a knee in the middle of the third round, and I believe that it cut Michael Chandler's face wide open on the left side of his face.
Oh, especially the amount of
And pretty much from there, the fight was over.
drilling I've done in the gym with that. We game plan everything. Everything that we do is meticulous. All the stuff that I do with my team. And you'll probably see some of the stuff from my videographer come out on YouTube the next few days of us throwing that knee and throwing some of the shots that we did in the fight. Yeah. And I just... everything went perfectly tonight. Everything went perfectly apart from this mat burn. That mat burn is no joke.
Well, if that's the worst thing that happened to you, I think you're all right in a fight with Michael Chandler. Do you think we're sleeping on your striking a little bit? Because, of course, I was going to bring up that knee, and that was sensational, and I think he was pretty much done from that moment.
Paddy the Baddy is a very talented striker. He's especially very powerful, and he's a guy that does have some striking ability. But he's not a guy that's completely flawless. And one thing that he's really got to watch out for is that he's really got to tighten up his defense and at certain times advertising certain shots. One thing you notice about Paddy sometimes is that his chin is wide out in the air and neither of his hands are up. And that is going to bite him in the ass one day. He's going to have to really watch out for that. And I'm not sure if he's really going to fix that, because that seems to be a problem with just certain fighters where they kind of just keep their hands down, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't really ever get fixed. And the reason why is because so many fighters believe that keeping their hands down and never keeping their hands within the range of their face, that if they're able to avoid that shot, that it makes their offense faster. And of course, that's true to a certain degree. That's why when you take a look at boxing, they don't just, at least the best of the best, they don't just take a look at a high guard. They'll also, put their hands away from their face or drop them down a little bit, because they're trying to invite a punch so they can move out of the way and then counter you. Yes, that is a way that you can set up traps at certain times. But if you keep your hands down, near your chest or like near your ribs the whole entire time, and you never keep them up within the vicinity of your face, that's just poor defensive strategy. It just is what it is. You're going to have to keep them up somewhat within the vicinity of your face if something comes back. And Paddy the Baddy is going to have to be very careful with that. He does not really do a very good job of keeping his right hand towards his face when he throws the left, or, keeping one hand up when he throws. So one of these days, I do believe that he is going to get caught. But he does seem to have a very good chin. He's very powerful. He's very talented on both the ground and, of course, also with that of the striking. And on top of that, he was absolutely huge in that Michael Chandler fight. Paddy is a guy that, he should easily be fighting at 170 the way that I seen him in that fight. He was absolutely humongous.
Are we underlooking your striking a bit?
Everyone underestimates me striking. Everyone thinks I'm just a grappler. You know what I mean? And I think, obviously no disrespect to the fighters who are mentioning here, Dustin, Justin and Charles. I've just put more of a clinic on the feet against Michael Chandler than they did. They got caught with shots against Chandler. I hardly got it. I think I got it with one overhand.
Chandler's another fighter that never really learned great defense. He's another one of these guys that has his hands all the way down to the lower part of his ribs. He tries to get offense, off better by countering certain guys and charging them. And, all that's great until you meet a fighter that is actually worth their salt.
In the first round. And I've seen the judges score.
And even some of the greater fighters that I've seen within MMA history, like that of a Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor would oftentimes kind of keep his hands down a little bit lower. Now, there would be times to where at his best, he would keep his hands up a little bit and block, but there would also be certain times to where you could see that his hands were dropped a little bit, especially after the Mayweather fight. Conor McGregor's defense got really sloppy, once he came back to the UFC. We've seen it against Khabib Nurmagomedov. We've seen it against Dustin Poirier. In that fight to where, Conor was probably winning that Dustin Poirier rematch. But, of course, eventually Dustin was able to catch him with something because Conor just doesn't keep his hands up enough. And he gets away with that oftentimes because of his exceptionally long reach for his size.
Did it as well. But whatever them two judges are, what give the first round to him needs sacking. They need giving the P45, lad. Because how on earth do you give...
And not to, talk too much about it, but the reason why those fighters get away with it with that long reach is because oftentimes they can get away with throwing a shot, and then their opponent, because of their long reach, them not being able to return back a shot, within time. If you have a reach advantage, that can be such an advantage in combat sports. It just really can be. It can make you throw certain shots, in a range, and then when your opponent wants to counter, they may not even be able to counter over the top because you may have a 6-inch reach advantage over them possibly. So, it can be a huge advantage. But then when you have someone that knows how to get in on that or has a comparable reach, all of a sudden you get hit with certain shots that you didn't see coming because your defensive strategy is a little bit lesser than what it needs to be, or your defensive tactics, so that's what ended up happening with Conor McGregor in there. He ended up getting his shots that he usually wouldn't see because usually he's not used to someone being able to return shots like that, especially with his reach.
First round to him, like he pushed me against the cage and held me there for a little minute or two, but whenever we were separate, I was the one striking on him, I was the one landing on him. He couldn't get near me, and that's what I said was going to happen. I said I'd keep him on the end of me jab, I'd keep him on the end of me punches, keep him on the end of me kicks, and I did it, and the game plan worked perfectly.
You are not a guy who is short on confidence. You've been that way, I think, really since your amateur career. I mean, you were on the forums talking trash to the trolls way back then.
Yeah.
But a fight like this, I mean, you did everything you said you were going to do. You said that, they say that he's got the more knockout power. I think if anybody gets knocked out, it's going to be him. He's got the Division I wrestling. I think I'll be fine in the wrestling department. And both of those proved to be true. But when you do it so convincingly, this does have to even raise your confidence even higher, right? To go out there and do that to somebody like Michael Chandler?
Yeah, of course. This just, like, I knew that I was going to do this. So it has obviously raised my confidence a bit more, but at the same time, I knew I was going to do this. I knew I was going to come out and I was going to beat Michael Chandler up. It was just where I was going to finish him. And I said this in the fighters meeting yesterday with DC, and
how the hell do they have Justin Gaethje at number 3? And Max Holloway just knocked his ass the fuck out.
Megan O'Leary and John Anik, I was like, there's so many different ways that I can see myself finishing him that I don't know how I'm going to do it. I said flying triangle, I said stepping in with an elbow, I said a knee, I said uppercut, I said me backhand, I said me left hook, I said a rear naked choke, I said the multiple different chokes, an armbar, I said ground and pound with elbows. I was saying I can't wait to 12-6 elbow someone. I finally got to do it.
I was going to say, it almost seemed like you had an option at one point. I mean, even Chael Sonnen was sitting up here and he was like, why isn't he throwing the choke on? It seems to be there. And it's like, do you want to get on top and throw those elbows?
Yeah, I wanted to get on top and throw those elbows. I wanted to... Like, obviously, I was looking for the submission, but after watching Charles fight him and Charles didn't get the submission, hunting for it for rounds, I thought, there's no point in hunting for a submission when I can finish him with ground and pound.
Agreed. And for those of you, of course, that are not fully aware about Charles de Bronx Oliveira, Charles Oliveira is one of the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners of all time. Like, when you talk about some of the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners of all time, of course, to join the UFC, I mean, of course, you're talking about Royce Gracie, but he was kind of more the guy that introduced it worldwide, at least, in the UFC. But of course, still a great practitioner. But of course, after him, you had great guys with the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. You had guys like, of course, Damian Maia. You have Fabricio Verdum, Charles Oliveira. Of course, all Brazilian fighters. I'm trying to think if there's anyone. Of course, Jake Shields. Maybe even George St. Pierre. Of course, you want to put him up there. John Jones, certain guys like that. And of course, let me also not underestimate Mr. Ilia Toporia's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills. Even though Ilia Topuria, he's a guy that, particularly means to strike and bang with you. He's a guy that has excellent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. For those of you that don't know, of course, he was the first one to defeat the very talented Bryce Mitchell, who, of course, has not been the most popular lately, of course, with his inflammatory statements, but still.
As I say, we game plan perfectly, and that's what we did. Like, I know he's got good submission defense, so we altered that and put it on him with ground and pound instead, because I knew I'd finish him. I knew I was getting the finish tonight. I said within 2, so it was a little 3 minutes too late, but I still got the finish within 3 rounds.
Well, you had some absolutely fun fights ahead of you here at all big names, all high ranks, superstars, really. It's felt like in the post-fight speech, Charles is the top one? Or
yeah, it's just Charles. Like, for me, Charles is a legend. Charles, former UFC lightweight champion, defended the belt twice, beat Dustin, beat Justin, beat Michael for the belt. Like,
Charles Oliveira, I was always glad to see him win the belt. I wish Dustin Poirier would have won the belt as well, because those are 2 fighters that I always used to cheer for. Back when I was younger, in my young teenage years, there were 3 fighters that I seen on the come up that, I always loved and that I always cheered for, that I, hoped that they would become a UFC champion eventually. But I never thought that they were eventually going to be able to do it, because they just never seemed to be able to really get over the hump in terms of winning their biggest fights. Those fighters were Dustin Poirier, Charles Oliveira, and Edson Barboza. And of course, for those of you that have been watching UFC for the past 10 years, you pretty much know all those fighters. Now, of course, Charles Oliveira, he was a guy that pretty much was known for losing all his big fights at 145, I believe, or, 155. He would lose to guys like Max Holloway, Frankie Edgar. I believe that he also lost to Anthony Pettis and other certain guys like that. But then, of course, I believe that he changed trainers, or at least changed corners to a certain degree. Then eventually, he kind of just went on a whole nother level. And he became a guy that was a extraordinary fighter. Dustin Poirier as well. Dustin Poirier was a guy that was known for losing a lot of the big fights at 145. He lost to Cub Swanson and Chen Sung Jung, also known as a Korean zombie. He also lost to Conor McGregor. And I believe that he lost to maybe one other fighter. Went up to 155, was having a decent run, lost to Michael Johnson, who was pretty much known as a very good gatekeeper. Then after that, of course, he went on a tear, beating guys like Eddie Alvarez, Anthony Pettis, Justin Gaethje, certain guys like that, So I was glad to at least see Dustin Poirier win the interim title, Charles Oliveira win the main title, Edson Barbosa, of course, he never really accomplished as much in his career, but, still a very talented fighter. But I was glad to see that those guys, at least those guys, Poirier, and Oliveira, to see them kind of, at least win somewhat of a belt.
He's a legend. He's got the most submissions in UFC history, and people say that he is the best submission artist the UFC's ever seen.
He's definitely up there. If he's not the best, then, he's up there. When you talk about, like I said, the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners that I've ever seen, especially the best submission artists, you're talking about Charles Oliveira. You're talking about Damian Maia. Of course, the Diaz brothers, especially Nate Diaz, because I think he has a little bit more submissions, at least in the UFC, under his belt. Fabricio Verdum, of course, who's probably the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner I've ever seen for a heavyweight. For those of you that did not see his fight against Cain Velasquez, he beat the shit out of that man. And Cain Velasquez was known as the guy that was the most talented at the time in the heavyweight division. A lot of people were arguing, actually, that Cain Velasquez was the most talented heavyweight ever at that particular time. And then, of course, Fabricio Verdum, he goes in there. They fight in Mexico City. Of course, a lot of people debate about the altitude. But in my view, Fabricio Verdum, he just had his number.
But I think I'm a better submission artist, so I'd love for that fight.
I'm not sure if you're a better submission artist there, Paddy the Batty, but what I will state is this. You definitely know what you're doing on the ground. I don't know if you're quite as sharp nor as good technically on the ground as the Charles Oliveira, but you definitely know what you're doing. And on top of that, with the size and, maybe with, the youth, you might have the edge over Charles Oliveira, especially the size.
But obviously then there's Justin, there's Dustin, there's Armin, but will he shit the bed and not turn up on the day? You never know. So, I don't know.
And of course, who they're talking about is Arman Tsarukyan, I believe that one Armenian fighter that, of course, was about to fight Islam in a rematch, but, of course, he had to pull out allegedly because of a back injury. So many people shit on fighters that end up having to back out of a fight. But, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt because Tsarukyan, so far, I believe, has not turned down a fight, but we'll see.
Want to fight him. Obviously, there's El Chirito as well, the Zilia Taporia.
Yes,
I forgot all about mentioning him in the post-fight interview. There's also Conor McGregor, who was seen put a bet on Michael Chandler. Know what I mean?
Conor McGregor is done. And there's no offense against Conor McGregor. Conor, of course, was one of my favorite fighters to watch when he was at his peak. But that dude has been done, for about 7 years. It's no offense against Conor, but I don't really have any particular interest in really seeing him come back. It just is what it is. He's been stating that he's going to come back for a very long time. But, it's time for him, to go. And it's no offense against Conor McGregor, but he's got to get his shit in order and shit in line, anyway. No offense, but he's getting involved in all this other shit, alleged sexual assaults and all this other stuff. More than likely a huge drug and cocaine and alcohol addiction from what I'm seeing with some of his facial changes and features, all this other stuff. So, Conor, I'm good on him. All-time great fighter for what he was able to accomplish, but he's done.
Outside his connection, lad. You're meant to back your own. So if he wants his head punching him when he comes back.
Now, to talk about Gaethje, that would be a very interesting fight. As for Dustin Poirier, apparently from what I hear, the rumors anyway, he's going to fight Max in a trilogy in the third fight. And I wouldn't be surprised if Max won that fight at all because Dustin Poirier, he just looks done. I think that he's looked done really ever since he lost to Justin Gaethje. He was never quite the same fighter after that. He's been old and visibly slower and clearly just more aged ever since those fights. And Dustin Poirier has just been in so many wars. You know, like Dustin Poirier, I believe, is only about 36 years old, or maybe a bit older. I don't know. But sometimes, a fighter can, that's why I always say it doesn't always matter on the age. You can have a fighter that's 38, 39 years old, but they'll be more fresh than a fighter that sometimes will be 33. It all depends on the wear and tear. And when you talk about Dustin Poirier, you're talking about grueling fights against Michael Chandler, Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway, Conor McGregor, Eddie Alvarez, Michael Chandler, Charles Oliveira, all these other guys, so it's like Islam Makhachev, Dustin Poirier, man, it's getting time for him to retire soon.
I'm game to beat McGregor up.
Yeah, I mean, I would take any one of those. And Ilia Topuria, I've got to believe that that's going to happen at some point. I was going to let you go, but then...
Of course, for those of you that don't know, Ilia Topuria and Mr. Paddy Pimblett, they of course have a disliking towards each other.
You just told me in my ear, they've got some video.
But he better watch out with Ilia Topuria, because Ilia Topuria, even though he's a bit smaller than Paddy, decently smaller, he's a better all-around fighter than Paddy.
Of something that happened backstage. You were...
Oh, yeah, this little maggot.
Can you tell us what's going on?
Paddy only does something when there's a camera about.
What happened?
And there, of course, there's Mr. Colby Chaos Covington. Perfect nickname for him. It's no offense against Colby Covington, but, he's been on the downslide for a while now. I'm not trying to hear anything from him. And there's no offense against Colby Covington, very talented fighter, but, he pretty much lost my interest after the way that he fought against Leon Edwards. He talks all this shit, talks all this fluff and muff, trying to get in Leon Edwards' head. He even brings up, Leon Edwards' dead father, which in my view was a shitty move. And then he fights like a complete pussy for the whole entire fight, barely tries to fight with him. And then has the nerve after the fight to say that, he thought that he won the fight. No offense on Colby, but he needs to take his ass home.
I seen him a power slap the other week and walked past him, staring at him, and he looked at the floor like that. And then now he knows there's a camera about. He walked past. So I just said to him, lad, I'll come and slap you, but you'll go and ring the police on me like you did with Masvidal, you little grass.
Little grass, you just...
Masvidal, another one of the more UFC's overrated fighters. There Paddy goes again. Like I said, reminds me of Tyson Fury.
There. Yeah, do you know what that means?
No idea.
Snitch.
Ah, okay.
Well, anyway, you can eat shit.
This guy reminds me so much. Reminds me a little bit of Tyson Fury when he was fighting Wilder. He ain't worth the sausage. He's a dosser.
He pays supermodels to stand with him, the fucking bum. He's a nobody. He's on a 3-fight losing streak or something. He's irrelevant. He's trying to use me now to stay relevant because he's a nobody. He's a bum. I'll beat Colby Covington for a laugh, but I've got bigger fish to fry than that little...
Agreed. Colby Covington is pretty much a has-been. He needs to take his ass home.
Mushroom.
Man, you do. You have a lot of...
A mushroom.
To fry, and I'm looking forward to every single one of those fights. The Ilia fight, again, has to happen. I just wonder where, when, but that one's going to be a big one when it happens. But they're all going to be big ones.
That's a pay-per-view headline with no time.
It's going to be interesting to see what Ilia plans to do next. Now, of course, Ilia Topuria, apparently what he did is that he relinquished his 145-pound title because he wants to fight that Islam Makhachev. Now, Islam apparently stated that he believes that Ilia needs to do more in terms of earning that title shot. Now, I have to wonder, is he really doing that for the benefit of the division, or is he doing that because he sees something in Ilia that he thinks might be a big challenge? Because Ilia, what I'll tell you is this, he may even be a bigger possible threat towards Islam than that of a Volkanovski. Now, maybe not, because Volkanovski is a great striker. He's also a guy that does great wrestling, and, he's smaller, especially in terms of height, but he also has a great reach, and on top of that, he's very stocky. Volkanovski is a guy that... for his build, he used to be, I believe, about 280 pounds or something like that in rugby. He's a guy that has a thicker build. So he may be able to handle Islam in some of those categories the way that maybe Ilia couldn't, but I don't know. But one thing I will say about Ilia is this. He's very talented and pretty technical in all areas. He's an excellent striker. He has wicked power in both hands. And on top of that, I believe that he's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he is an excellent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artist. But, of course, oftentimes Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artists, they usually get out-wrestled, especially by that of the elite wrestlers, especially that of the Dagestanis. But we'll see.
Title on the line, know what I mean? You don't need a title on the line for that. That's just a pay-per-view headliner right there.
Well, we'll let you get out of here, eat some food, enjoy Miami, enjoy the win, and we'll wait to see what's next for you, man. Congratulations, Paddy.
Well, congratulations, Mr. Paddy the Paddy Pimblett. It's going to be very interesting to see who he fights next. I would love to see him fight Charles Oliveira or Sarukian. We'll see what ends up happening. But it sounds like more than likely they're going to try to get his fight next against Charles Oliveira. And I do believe that he more than likely would be the favorite there. But we'll see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.